All planned. Joy is an act of resistance. These words penned by an unlikely poet, an unlikely advocate, and bearer of joy. Claude Derricott was born in Hamtramck, Michigan on April 12, 1941. She is the daughter of Antonio Baquet, a Creole from Louisiana, and Benjamin Sweeney Webster, who hailed from Kentucky. Her childhood was plagued with the unhappiness of her parents' marriage. Much of her childhood, when spent away from home, was with her grandparents, who owned a funeral parlor. And so it was that young Derricott would creep down at night and say a prayer over whomever's body was in the parlor. She was a light-skinned black girl in an African-American neighborhood where she was sent to a Catholic school that, in her own words, was steeped in images of death and punishment. In 1962, during her junior year of college, she gave birth to a boy in a home for unwed mothers. And by 1967, she had moved to New York City, and her poetry began to emerge for the first time publicly. It was filled with her stories of her childhood, of passing white and being discovered, of her identity and her family's understanding of escaping poverty and their disdain for their relatives who did not escape, of gender oppression and strife. When she moved to Montclair, New Jersey in 1974, hers was the first black family to live in Upper Montclair. She led, by her own accounts, a life of rebellion and at times a life of struggle. And so when this poet, with the life story that she had, accepted a literary award for a lifetime of achievement, including starting a consortium of Black and African American poets, I think it surprised one or two of those who were her students devoted to her work when she added this line almost as a throwaway at the end before she left the stage. Joy, she said, is an act of resistance. But then Derricott had followed her joy like a rope in a blizzard back to base camp. It brought her safety. And perhaps moreover than that, it meant that her life was about more than survival. It was also about thriving. I've been playing over and over and over again this past year the song When Joy Comes Back. I had a sense that I wanted to be ready for this year. I wanted to be ready for when joy comes back to me. I think part of being ready in this year, in a year that will bring continued political challenge and personal challenge and soul challenge, is finding how liberation inhabits my being. How I get free of a world where I too was raised with stories of a punishment and atonement, that somehow I didn't deserve joy, I was told. Anyone else raised with any of these stories? And so I'm asking from the individual self now, how is liberation achieved for all of us? How do we sustain movement in these times where it's exhausting for a lot of us? Anyone been exhausted in 2017?
Amen.
Yeah. I think it has to do with how we cultivate and allow joy in our being, in our midst, especially in times of peril. I think it comes from being free enough to experience the full range of life and being open to the creative in your midst, not only for the artists among us, the formal artists, but for the artist in all of us, and seeing the windows to the worlds that can yet be possible. I recently read a story that Reverend Emily shared about Sarah Silverman and her response to a tweet on social media. Now, I'm not going to say what the tweet was, because if you've read the story, you know you can't say something like that, even in a Unitarian Universalist sanctuary. But needless to say, you can imagine somebody responded to something Sarah Silverman said with a not-so-nice word, okay? Just they called her a bad person. And so Sarah Silverman responded to that person by saying, I've looked at your profile and I can tell you're in a lot of pain. And I've been in that pain too. And I hope that you're able to find a way to get out of it. And the tweeter responded back, acknowledging that he'd been in a lot of pain and talked about abuse that he'd endured and how it had shaped his life. And she responded, I hope you can get help, and here are some ways that you can get help. And he responded saying that he was unemployed and he couldn't work because of a back injury and that he wasn't able to get the medical treatment he needed for his back. And suddenly, this quick exchange, which had been about a very partisan political engagement, became two human beings across how many miles and levels of distinction, of difference, caring for one another. And then he said, I'm sorry I gave you, and that's another word I can't say in the sanctuary, but he apologized in his own words. And then Sarah Silverman found some folks who are physical therapists to help offer him care. And she promised to help offset the cost of the treatment so that he could help get his back in better shape and perhaps return to work. And what struck me about that was not that Sarah Silverman took time to respond to a tweet when she gets however many in response to what she does, but the creativity in that response. Every resistance movement to injustice or abuse has centered the creative spirit. And often, in the midst of struggle, in the midst of resistance, in the midst of times of great rancor, has brought joy, beauty, and love as defiance to hate, pain, and suffering. In early Christianity, long before there was a Christian church, the stories of Jesus and his defiance of the Roman authorities, well, it was a little unsettling, as you can imagine, to some leaders. And many early Christian communities had to, therefore, exist underground, and they had to find ways to communicate with one another without making it as plain as day. And so they looked for images to represent their community and what they believed in and what they valued most. And the most common image in the early Christian church was not the cross. It was a symbol of life. When you look at the paintings that were created in homes by early artists who were inspired by the Jesus movement, they painted the resurrected Jesus. They painted images of the Garden of Eden. They didn't focus on the cross. They reminded one another in a time of peril what they were about at their core. Take the temple workers in India who protested that those who cleaned and maintained some of the most holy sites in India, were not being given a living wage. And so their protest was to let the offerings pile up and rot. A creative response to an unjust situation. Take the creative resistance of nonviolence in each age, a movement of people who allow love to inhabit their beings and completely dismantle and disarm dictators. So how will we resist? Will we have joy within our beings? Will we be ready when joy comes back? My grandmother was somewhat like Dara Cobb. Not in her ability to write poetry, but in how her life evolved. She was the youngest of 9 children who grew up during the Depression with 2 alcoholic parents And she said she remembers the nights when the yelling got so loud that she would come downstairs and find them with furniture in their hands ready to throw at one another. It was a tumultuous home, and she was often alone. All of her siblings were much older and had left the home and did not come back. She wasn't able to finish school beyond 6th grade because she was often taking care of her parents. She worked much of her adult life cleaning foundries and then cleaning up cafeterias. And she was perhaps one of the most joyous people that I have ever met. The only time I ever saw her get really angry at me was one day I was just in a mood, and she was a target. And so I just started picking at her. Have you ever done this? Please tell me I'm not like the only person who's ever done this. And I just started picking at her, just being nasty for no reason. And she snapped around and said, "Cut it out. You're being mean, and you've no right to be mean." And I was kind of stunned because she never raised her voice. And then she said, "Come here, I want to show you something." And she took me outside and sat me down on the porch and said, "Watch." And we just sat there and watched this spider spinning and repairing the most magnificent web. In retrospect, looking at the long depression my grandfather lived with and the potential for many regrets that my grandmother had, I think her, what I thought was irrational joy, was an act of resistance. I think it saved her life, and I think it saved the lives of her children. Unitarian Universalists, especially our Unitarian ancestry, we can be a little earnest. In the height of the Universalist revivals, when Universalists would gather in tent camps and sing songs and just bring light and joy to the communities they went to, well, the Unitarians in Boston, they got together and decided to outlaw the Universalists from coming into town. I worked at the First Church in Boston that had a big portrait of one of those Unitarians who said, "No, you are not coming into town, Charles Chauncey." And I tell you, he looked as if he suffered from some serious indigestion. I think must have made him unhappy. The reason that the Unitarians said that the Universalists couldn't come into Boston was because that joy, that emotion, might overtake people. And that's the thing, at the core of oppression, by the very word oppression, whether it's internal or an external force, at the core of it is a mistrust of the creative spirit, mistrust of human emotion, of joy, of those things that cause us to move and to be in ways that we couldn't imagine beforehand. It is childish, we are told, to laugh, or somehow not as serious as the work of life. You have to earn joy, do your job, earn your vacation, earn your fun. You can't just burst out in joy. That's not right. And my, how they tell us to work ourselves to death. To death. To avoid pleasure. That should not be a word said in a sanctuary. And to control ourselves and one another. And yet, the world is evolved by often what seems as madness at the time, by those who follow their joy and obsession, and by the refusal of the human endeavor to be controlled. Liberation theologian Elaine Padilla writes about this when she describes the context of fiestas in some Latinx culture. Parties that are held without function, stay with me, and without a start time or an end time. They just organically arise. In Festival, we see, she writes, what can come of exiles who co-create wilderness in community. celebrations of human diversity as manifestations of the divine and movements with the divine. These are fiestas that humans cannot control without a timestamp for their end or productive outcome, and they cross the boundaries and liberate humanity into a holy interaction. You never know when the creative spirit is going to burst out. It just comes out. And it's powerful. I recently went to a very serious meeting on anti-racism and anti-oppression. It is the type of thing that is easy to go to with a little bit of earnestness on your shoulders and to forget the soul work, the joy in the ministry of it. So this is an annual gathering. It's a national committee that I sit down on, and we gather once a year in person, and then the rest of our work is done via Zoom or conference calls. So last year was my first year on the group, and this thing happened that at least those of us who were involved in it tend to recall with some hilarity. And when we tell other people, they usually don't laugh. So I won't feel bad if I tell you this story and you don't laugh. There's no pressure to laugh. I haven't even told the story. So we were gathered in this retreat center, Catholic retreat center, and there were also a group of sisters that lived there, all the time. And so the floors are identified by your gender identity. You have to, so if you're identified as a woman, you have to be on a certain floor, and only women are allowed on that floor, and then the next floor is a floor of sisters, then the next floor is a floor of men. Do you get it?
Yes.
Okay. So there's rules, and you don't go down the back stairwell into the floor with the sisters, because those are their homes, and that's rude to walk into somebody's home without telling them. So, at any rate, my colleagues and I, who are identified as women, were on the floor for women when we came back from a midday meeting, and we noticed that there was an open door to one of the bedrooms. So they're little, individual bedrooms, and then you have a shared bathroom. And this man was just sitting at a desk in the room. And we looked at one another because we knew the rules, and he looked like a priest maybe, and we thought, well, just go back to our room, we can be flexible with the rules. But it was a little weird that someone had their bedroom door open, right? And they're just staring at you, sitting in their bedroom. A little strange, but whatever. So we went to dinner that night, and when we came back, the room door was open, and the light was on, and it looked a bit like maybe the man had collapsed on the bed. And it was only 7 o'clock at night. And so the reasonable thing seemed to be to go into the room and see if he was all right. Now, some of us dispute if that was a reasonable next step. But one of my colleagues went in, and I watch a lot of horror movies. And so I thought, if one of us goes, we're just going to start getting killed off. So I have to go with her to make sure she doesn't get killed off, and then eventually I get killed off, because then I'll be left alone. So I walked into the room, and we nudged what we thought was the man's body, and it wasn't. It was just a pile of blankets. But while we were in there, we happened to notice that in the bathroom, it looked like there might be a body that had collapsed in the shower. And not wanting to find someone we didn't know all that well, naked and dead, we went back into the hallway. This all seemed quite rational. And there was someone that we were told was on duty at night, for the building, for security. And so we called him and we explained that we'd gone in the room because we thought the man had collapsed on the bed, but actually we thought he was naked in the bathroom. We couldn't please go on. So there we have it. So Patrick is his name, very earnest man, came up and said, well, how can I help you? There's no men staying on this floor. We said, oh, there is. There was a man staring at us earlier, but now we think he's dead in the shower. So we're going to check. Needless to say, it was a towel and a shadow, but it really looked like the body at the time, and we were quite sure of it. So we tell this story to one another throughout the year, kind of, and we allude to it, right? So one time the convener of the committee, in the midst of a call, picked up a towel and then just put it down. So it's kind of a running joke. So we had new members coming onto the committee this year. And I told myself the whole way there, and I told Emily, I'm not going to tell the story. I'm going to be good this year. I'm going to be serious. We're going to get into the work. I'm going to be earnest, darn it. I made it like 10 minutes. And we all started laughing as you started laughing and telling the story and explaining why. Sometimes we would pick up a towel in the middle of a meeting. And we just let loose. And then I caught myself. And I stopped myself from being just happy. And I said, I'm sorry for telling that story. I'm really sorry for pulling us away from our agenda. And being an earnest group, we all self-corrected to get better. And said, you're right. And I felt really badly, as if I'd done something wrong. And that night, as I was walking back to my room, I thought of my grandmother and all the time she used to dance in our living room, bedazzled with costume jewelry. And I thought of her calling me back to the porch to look at the spider web. So what's the fuss? A few words scrawled on a wall, a dance that includes some defense moves, a song about crossing the river, a little graffiti of a dictator depicted as a baby, laughter in response to cruelty, love in answering hate. These cannot really take on the massive powers of the world. Yes, indeed they can, responds the character Don Paolo, a revolutionary disguised as a priest. But it's sufficient for one little man, just one ordinary little man, to say no. And the whole of that formidable granite order is imperiled. One no to a life of toil, one no to the deprivation of the human spirit, one no to the winter of our souls, one no against the thousands, the millions, the billions of words of pamphlets, one no, one song, one act of joy. So let's get ready this year. Let's follow our joy like a rope in a blizzard to base camp. Let's defy the dictators and care for our beings as the sacred vessels that they are. Let's let laughter and love and the spark of creativity flow against the hard rock of an earnest life. And let us watch as justice will yet roll. Justice will roll down like waters, and righteousness like an everlasting stream. And we, beloved, will wake up one morning with freedom